Timmins James Bay.
Madame la Présidente, as always, extremely honored to stand in this house, the People's House, representing the people of Timmins James Bay, on unceded Algonquin territory. So let's just reflect on that a moment. That's not just some nice thing that we Canadians now say when we do the land recognition. It's a statement of understanding that there are outstanding historical rights and land issues that are running across our country, and we need to acknowledge that. And that's one of the reasons that we're here today, because we're at an unprecedented moment in Canada's history. A moment where we all come together and rise up to meet the challenge, or we give in to our lazier base motives of political machismo and spite. And I believe, Madame President, we're dealing with a crisis now that has moved out from Wet'suwet'en territory across Canada, and it requires leadership. It requires us as parliamentarians recognizing and being honest with each other. This is bigger than all of us. But if we do not rise to the task, the risks to our nation right now are very serious. So we can come together and try and untangle this extremely complex Gordian knot, or we could play to the usual base in this house of division. I find this opposition motion from the Conservatives to be very, very telling about the political tactics that we are standing in this house today to, quote, condemn the radical activists who are exploiting divisions within the Wet'suwet'en community. It is our job to recognize that there needs to be a conversation with the Wet'suwet'en people, but with Indigenous people across this country. Not for us to say, well, if you support a gas line, we will support you. To have Parliament come down in the middle of a very tense motion. But then, Madam Speaker, I point to the other motion that the Conservatives were bringing forward. They were willing to use this national crisis to actually try and bring down the government, to save the opposition leader political career who's been rejected by his own party. That's not leadership. That's more of the same kind of joker chaos politics that we do not need at this time. Madam Speaker, this past weekend, I joined thousands of young people in the streets of Ottawa. People who are marching in Montreal, people in Halifax, people in Vancouver. And it was extremely inspiring to see these young people, young Indigenous leadership, stepping forward at the front of the march. And I spoke to many of them. I said, where are you from? Kanesatake, Kittigan-Zibi, Fort Albany, Barrier Lake. And I think of the leader of the opposition who told these young Indigenous people to check their privilege. Now, I know he wasn't serious. I know he was just doing it as a dig, just as a slur, just as a spite. But that's not leadership. Because the message it's sending to this young generation is that this Parliament is in opposition to their hopes and dreams. And that's not Canada. Because I think of the young woman I met from Fort Albany, and they would say, tell her to check her privilege. When her grandparents this week were at federal court on the St. Anne's residential school crisis, where we have had some of the worst crimes committed against children in history, committed against the federal government, and they're still fighting, the grandparents and the grandmothers at Fort Albany, and they would tell this young woman, check your privilege. I was thinking of Kanesatake and the Mohawk people who've been there since long before us and will be there long after us. And the leader of the opposition telling this woman, check your privilege. Of course, him with his $900,000 slush fund for treats and perks. That's quite privileged. But you know, I was also thinking of Barrier Lake when I met this amazing young woman who spoke up from Barrier Lake, Quebec. And in Barrier Lake, where their territory has been stripped of forestry, where their territory has been flooded out time and time again by the massive hydro dams, and they've received nothing from their territory. That's what her parents and her grandparents and her great-grandparents have fought, is just to stay on that land. to tell her to check her privilege. It's not on. And then there was Kittigan-Zibi. So many young people from Kittigan-Zibi. And Madam Speaker, Kittigan-Zibi is not very far from Ottawa. And it's an incredible community, Algonquin community, and it's right beside Maniwaki. And Maniwaki has clean drinking water and Kittigan-Zibi doesn't. And we have a Conservative Party who tells the world we can drive a bitumen pipeline through the Rocky Mountains, but we can't get clean water to a community this close to Ottawa. That's why they're marching, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, what we need to do here today is not play games with these kind of motions that the Conservatives are trying to divide the Wet'suwet'en people, but to say we have a much bigger crisis and we need to start to untangle this and find a way to de-escalate. Because, Madam Speaker...
Excuse me, can you respect the time of speech that the Honourable Member has? Can we listen to what he's saying and then you can ask questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't lose any sleep over angry Conservatives heckling and shouting. They're the same kind of people who are on Twitter, and they probably got their own troll farm giving them messages. But we need here to deal with a way to end the railway blockades. And this is what I want to talk about. How do we move forward on that? Because I'm very, very concerned that this issue could spiral out of control very quickly. And so to see the language from the Conservatives about the mob and the radicals and the professional protesters and the eco-terrorists is really putting us on more and more dangerous ice. And I was shocked, I was absolutely shocked that Peter MacKay would post a tweet of an ugly confrontation of some guy in a truck shouting at young Indigenous people and telling him to drop dead. And Peter MacKay promoting that vigilantism. That is not what we do in Canada. And we cannot allow that to happen. Because I would urge my Conservatives to remember what happened at Oka and Nelson Patog. And I remember Mike Harris telling and standing up at Ipperwash and saying, I want those GD Indians out of the park. And Dudley George died, and an OPP's office career was ruined. And never again would the OPP take those kind of orders from a government ordering them in. So I'm very, very pleased today to see that the RCMP are offering to step down on Wet'suwet'en, and that's a good first step. And Madam Speaker, I want to just take a minute here to recognize two important people that I've gotten to know. The late Wayne Russett of the RCMP, who I negotiated with many times, who was an incredible diplomat for defusing situations on blockades. Because I got my political start, Madam Speaker, on a railway blockade. And the Conservatives make it seem like, oh, this is just with people who are lazy and don't want to go to work. When you are on a blockade, it's because you have no other choice, because you've been betrayed by a process and betrayed by a system. And it took the people of Northern Ontario standing up on a railway blockade to get the issues of environmental protection on our land recognized. And it brought Canada to a better place. And one of the key negotiators beside Wayne Russett was Officer Jim MacDonald of the OPP, who came in on with the subpoena and the injunction. And Officer Jim MacDonald was a big man, big voice. And we became very, very good friends because he knew what we were doing was right. And he knew that the OPP were being put in a very, very difficult position. So we need to start looking at how to defuse this situation. The PM's claim to replace the RCMP with Indigenous police, to me, is showing a continued lack of leadership. The Prime Minister needs to move beyond saying, well, we're here to talk and we're here to listen, and I appreciate the Minister's talk about how we're going to move things forward over the next number of years. We have a crisis now. And when I see young Indigenous people walking in the streets with signs that say reconciliation is dead, it is heartbreaking. But it is something I've heard again and again in the communities as their frustrations grow, and that frustration is real. And it's up to us to say that reconciliation is not dead, because reconciliation is the obligation of the government and the settler state, because Indigenous people have nothing to reconcile about. It was their lands that were taken. It their children that were taken. It was their rights and their rules of law that have been undermined time and time again. So when they're walking in the streets saying reconciliation is dead, it's up to us to raise the bar. So the Prime Minister has said he's willing to listen, and I think that that's a good sign, but he needs to be willing to listen and to meet. He needs to show leadership. Because what's happening in the Wet'suwet'en territory now has touched off something much bigger and much more tense and much more complex. The possibility of something going wrong at one of those railway blockades is very real. The possibility of someone getting hurt, the possibility of some idiot driving a truck through a crowd is very real. And that's why the words that we say in this House matters. We have to be able to de-escalate this. But in order to get these blockades off, and Madam Speaker, they are putting enormous economic pressure on our country right now. That's why we need to be able to put an offer on the table. In order for people to step back from a blockade, they need to know that something is going to change. So this morning, the RCMP said that they're willing to step out of the Wet'suwet'en territory. I think that's a very, very good step. To do that, then, we can't just say, well, as the Prime Minister suggested, replacing with Indigenous police and life carries on. We need a time for discussion. We need to ask Coastlink to suspend work and moving into the territory while this negotiation takes place. It's not that radical a thing to say because nothing is going to happen in that territory till this gets decided anyways. Number 3, it needs to be the Prime Minister himself who goes to Wet'suwet'en territory and sits down and meet. And I'm very pleased that the Minister of Indigenous Services met with the Mohawks in Belleville. I think that is a very positive step, but it's the Prime Minister who needs to show leadership. He needs to put on the table that we will deal with these issues between the hereditary chiefs and the elected band councils. And I have nothing negative to say for the people who signed the agreements. I have nothing to say for the negative to say about the political leaders who move forward and the business people who move forward believing they had an agreement. But clearly, within the Indigenous community, there is a deep divide that needs to be addressed, and we need the Prime Minister there. I would say that the Prime Minister needs to meet and appoint a special emissary to start building trust. I can't speak for Senator Murray Sinclair. I've spoken with him on this issue. Someone like a Murray Sinclair, someone of a stature that's respected, that then we would agree that nothing happens till we go through this. And are we then going to say then the pipeline just moves ahead? Well, no. We are going to sit down and talk with the Wet'suwet'en people and find out where we go next. And then I would ask the Prime Minister, following an agreement to set up those meetings, to reach out to the Mohawk people who are on the blockades, because we need to get the trains moving, and to urge them to recognize that there will be huge impacts on all of us. But they are going to want to see good faith, because they're not going to just walk away at this moment. And we need, Madam Speaker, the 5th issue, which is probably the most difficult for the government to agree to. We need a coherent plan to deal with the catastrophic climate change that's coming. The days when it was just business as usual and we'll just keep pumping up the greenhouse gas emissions without any credible plan, it's hit the brick wall. And when I was out on the street seeing young people marching everywhere, they get it. They get that the promise, we'll get you another pipeline and we'll plant some trees, and then we'll get another pipeline, we'll plant some more trees. That's not cutting it. They want to know why our carbon footprint is getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year. So we need to have a credible plan, and certainly that's going to be a discussion about Tech Frontier right now, because Jason Kenney has put that front and center, and this has become the Conservative proxy war that is destabilizing, I believe, the issues that we need to address in order to get this blockade issue dealt with. You know, Madam Speaker, I remember on the October Thanksgiving weekend of 2000, I'd never ever dreamed of becoming a politician, and I was standing on the blockade when the OPP came at night and set up their cars to come and arrest my neighbors, who are farmers, who are miners, who are Algonquin and Ojibwe people standing to defend the watershed of the region. and I got a call from the Crown Prosecutor's Office. The Crown Prosecutor's Office, I'm not going to say who was in the office, but someone called me, said, we just got a call from Mike Harris. He wants 100 people arrested now. And I said to the Crown Prosecutor's Office, what are you going to do? And he said, there's not a judge within 300 kilometers who will sign a mass warrant for arrests, because we know this is a tense situation. All we're asking the demonstrators to do is not escalate. And we actually had this dance of negotiations between police and the protesters, who both understood that we needed to find a way out of this without it spiraling, because it can spiral very, very, very fast, Madam Speaker. And having that experience of negotiating with police, I understand the tensions that they are put under in this situation. So it's very unhelpful to have the Conservatives speak again and again and again about enforcing injunctions, because there are so many rail crossings across this country. There are so many ways that people can rise up, and they are rising up. So I'd like to say, Madam Speaker, that this is a moment when Canada could recognize that this crisis, it could have been this LNG project, it could have been tech, it could have been any number of things, but this has been 150 years in the making. And this young generation of Indigenous are going to be heard. And it is up to this Parliament to say we have to find a way to rise up to this challenge, to recognize that it's bigger than all of us, to recognize the dangers of allowing this thing to spiral, because if it spirals and someone gets hurt, then there are going to be no trains running. And the impacts and the divisions between Canadians are going to be enormous. And talking with some of the young Indigenous people, and I have to say, in Ottawa when they were marching, the amount of people on the streets who waved, who showed support, that's what Canada is. Canada is a country that is coming to terms with its colonial past that we never understood we had, but we have it, and it's there, and it's real, and it's being lived in the lives of young generation of First Nation children. I saw this sign that one young person posted, and she said, first, you tried to take off our land, now you're trying to take our children. You know, I mean, the Conservatives might think that's apple and oranges, but we have a $10 billion class action lawsuit being brought forward by the AFN. We have a government that spent millions of dollars fighting against the principle that there has been systemic and reckless discrimination, not historic, ongoing, against First Nation children. What is the most important relationship to First Nation people? It's not a pipeline, I can tell you that. It's their children. And they've never seen a commitment to address the fact that the ongoing destruction of the children's families, their identities, is ongoing. So when they talk about the rule of law on the Conservative side, that doesn't really pass the nod test in Indigenous communities that know that when they sign agreements with the federal government, those agreements last just as long as the government wants them to last, and they walk away. I've seen that in Barrier Lake. We had a beautiful agreement to rebuild that community. They walked away. I saw that in Saskatchewan, where we had the plan to move them off, and we had a signed agreement. They walked away on that. We've had commitments on ending the fights at the child welfare, and government walked away on that. So being nice and saying we're going to listen and saying take down the barricades and the blockades isn't going to cut it with Indigenous people who've been lied to time and time and time again. But there's an urgency right now, Madam Speaker, an urgency to try and de-escalate this situation, particularly in the regions, and I'm not saying anything less about the Wet'suwet'en and what's happening in the Wet'suwet'en territories, and discussion that needs to happen. We need to get this addressed, but we need to get the trains moving and to give Canadian certainty that we're apprised of the seriousness, and that's going to come from leadership from the Prime Minister. But it is also, we need to send a message to the Indigenous youth who are marching across Canada and their allies that the issue of reconciliation is not dead. We just haven't done a very good job on it, and that the issue of environmental crisis is real, that the planet is burning, and Canada has failed. And when we address that, then I think, Madam Speaker, we will be moving to a better place, because there is nothing better, there's nothing more hopeful in this country than this young generation of Indigenous people who will transform this nation for the better. Thank you very much.